In the automotive world, there's a lazy myth that refuses to die. That the 1970s were a dark age, that cars from that decade were unreliable, underpowered, badly built, and fundamentally flawed, that your father bought junk and paid the price for it. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Most 1970s cars weren't bad at all. They were simply misunderstood by the people buying them. In fact, many of the cars we now mock for being terrible were doing exactly what they were designed to do, just not what buyers assumed they would do. Your father didn't buy a bad car. He bought the wrong expectations. Because the 1970s weren't a normal decade for cars, they weren't even a normal decade for money. Fuel crises shattered confidence. Inflation chewed through wages. Governments rewrote emissions and safety laws almost overnight. Engineers were forced to redesign engines, suspensions, and structures faster than factories could realistically adapt. And buyers walked into dealerships carrying 1960s expectations. They expected effortless reliability. They expected strong performance. They expected minimal maintenance. They expected yesterday's simplicity in a world that had already moved on. What they got instead were transitional machines. Cars built to survive a decade of uncertainty, regulation, and scarcity. When those cars didn't behave like the ones that came before them, disappointment followed, then blame, then decades of bad reputation. Today, we're going to correct that misunderstanding. Not by pretending every 1970s car was brilliant, some genuinely deserved criticism, but by explaining why so many competent, intelligently engineered cars were blamed for problems that weren't really theirs. We'll look at 7 cars from the decade, cars that families bought with hope, cars that failed expectations, not engineering logic. Because once you understand what the 1970s actually demanded from a car, you'll realize the buyers, not the machines, were usually the problem. To understand why so many 1970s cars were judged harshly, you have to strip away modern hindsight and step back into the decade itself. The problem wasn't just the cars, it was the timing. The 1970s opened with momentum left over from the 1960s. Fuel was cheap, wages were rising. Car ownership still felt like progress. Bigger engines, simpler mechanics, and emotional buying decisions had shaped an entire generation of expectations. Then the world changed, abruptly. The 1973 oil crisis didn't just raise fuel prices. It shattered confidence. Petrol doubled almost overnight. Long queues appeared at stations. Governments imposed restrictions. Suddenly, fuel economy wasn't a footnote. It was survival. Just as families adjusted, the 1979 oil shock hit again. Inflation surged. Interest rates climbed. Household budgets were stretched thin. Buying a car became a defensive decision, not an aspirational one. At the same time, governments rewrote the rulebook. New emissions regulations forced engines to run leaner, hotter, and cleaner, often without the technology to do so gracefully. New safety standards demanded reinforced structures, impact absorption, and crash survivability. That added weight and complexity. Noise limits, fuel standards, and taxation policies shifted year by year. Manufacturers didn't have decades to refine solutions. They had months. What emerged were transitional cars, not final answers, but necessary steps. Engines choked by early emission systems, suspensions redesigned for comfort over speed, bodies strengthened for safety before rust-proofing science caught up. But buyers didn't recalibrate their expectations. They still expected 1960s durability. From engines now under stress, they still expected performance. From motors deliberately detuned, they still expected minimal maintenance. From machines that required adjustment and attention, they still expected rust resistance. From steel treated as if it was still 1965. Dealerships didn't help. Brochures promised advanced engineering, without explaining the cost of that advancement. Salesmen sold progress as perfection, so when cars demanded care, discipline, and compromise, owners felt cheated. The truth is simple, but uncomfortable. Most 1970s cars were not failures of engineering. They were victims of a decade that changed faster than buyers were willing to understand. The Austin Allegro has become one of the most ridiculed cars in British automotive history. Square steering wheel jokes, awkward proportions, endless British Leyland disaster headlines. Today, it's treated as proof that the 1970s were a mechanical failure, but that reputation only makes sense if you judge the Allegro by the wrong criteria. In 1975, this car was never meant to impress. It was meant to cope. Priced at roughly $1,300 new, about $10,000 in today's money, the Allegro was aimed squarely at families squeezed by inflation, rising fuel costs, and stagnant wages. It wasn't a driver's car. It wasn't aspirational. It was supposed to be comfortable, economical, and unintimidating. And on paper, it made sense. Underneath the awkward styling was a surprisingly thoughtful engineering package. Front-wheel drive maximized cabin space and traction. The Hydrogas suspension system gave the Allegro an unusually soft, controlled ride on Britain's broken post-industrial roads. Engines ranged from 1.1 to 1.75 litres, tuned for low-end torque rather than speed. Exactly what stop-start urban driving demanded. But here's where the misunderstanding begins. This was not a modern car in the way buyers imagined modernity. It wasn't maintenance-free. It wasn't fit and forget. The Hydrogas system needed periodic pressure checks. Carburetors required adjustment as seasons changed. Ignition timing actually mattered. Owners treated it like an appliance. The Allegro needed to be treated like a machine. When that didn't happen, problems followed. Build quality varied wildly between factories, and even between shifts. Rust protection was basic at best. Panel alignment could be optimistic. None of that helped its image. But the real damage came from neglect. Suspension units left unserviced collapsed. Poorly tuned engines ran hot and rough. Early corrosion, ignored, became structural rot. Mechanics from the era will tell you something uncomfortable. Well-maintained Allegros often ran quietly and comfortably for years. Neglected ones disintegrated quickly and loudly. Families expecting the carefree ownership of a 1960s Ford felt betrayed. The car wasn't forgiving. It didn't mask mistakes. It reflected them. That's why the Allegro failed in the public imagination. Not because it was inherently bad, but because it demanded care. At a moment when buyers wanted effortlessness, the Allegro wasn't built for enthusiasm. It was built for survival, in a difficult decade, and judged on those terms alone. It did exactly what it was designed to do. Lancia Beta, 1972-1984. If the Austin Allegro was mocked for being dull, the Lancia Beta was punished for being too clever. This was the car that nearly destroyed Lancia's reputation outside Italy. And yet, mechanically, it was one of the most sophisticated family cars of the 1970s. That contradiction is the key to understanding what went wrong. By the late 1970s, the Beta sat firmly in the aspirational bracket. Prices hovered around $2,400, $2,800, putting it well above basic British family cars. Buyers weren't choosing it because it was cheap. They were choosing it because it felt continental, modern, and intelligent. Twin-cam engines, front-wheel drive, sharp steering, clean, contemporary styling. On the road, a Beta felt alive, in a way many rivals didn't. Under the skin, the engineering was genuinely impressive. Engines ranged from 1.6 to 2.0 litres, producing strong, flexible power for the era. Handling was composed and confidence-inspiring. The chassis balance was excellent. In period road tests, journalists praised its refinement and road manners. But the Beta was engineered with an assumption that proved fatal. It assumed owners would pay attention. The steel quality was poor. Yes, that's not revisionism. Rust protection was inadequate for northern European climates. But the real issue was where corrosion occurred. Structural areas, suspension mounting points, subframes, places you couldn't ignore, without consequences. Italian maintenance culture expected frequent inspections, regular washing of underbodies, early intervention. British buyers did none of that. Drainage channels blocked. Moisture sat trapped. Early corrosion went unseen. Dealers downplayed risks because admitting them would kill sales. By the time rust became visible, the damage was already terminal, and that's why the betrayal felt so severe. The Beta drove beautifully, right up until it became unsafe. Owners didn't experience gradual decline. They experienced sudden collapse. One MOT inspection could end the car's life overnight. Families who loved how it drove felt cheated. Mechanics felt embarrassed delivering the news. resale values collapsed. But here's the uncomfortable reality. The Beta wasn't badly engineered. In concept, it was optimistically engineered. It relied on a level of owner involvement that no longer existed by the late 1970s. Buyers wanted convenience, not commitment. They wanted sophistication without responsibility. Lancia gave them sophistication and paid the price. The brand never fully recovered in markets like the UK. The damage wasn't just mechanical, it was psychological. Trust was broken. The Beta didn't fail because it was junk. It failed because advanced engineering, without realistic ownership assumptions, is a gamble, and in the 1970s, that gamble didn't pay off. Volkswagen Type 2, T2, bus, 1970s. Few vehicles from the 1970s have been romanticized more aggressively than the Volkswagen Type 2. Today, it represents freedom, counterculture, and simplicity. In the 1970s, many owners thought it was slow, fragile, and deeply disappointing. That disconnect comes from one basic mistake. People bought it, expecting a car. In reality, the Type 2 was industrial equipment with windows. Volkswagen never designed the T2 to behave like a saloon. It was a utility platform, a commercial vehicle, adapted for families, tradesmen, and campers. It prioritized packaging, durability, and mechanical simplicity over performance or refinement. The engineering reflected that. Air-cooled flat-4 engines sat at the rear, producing modest power, but offering ease of access, and mechanical simplicity. There was no radiator to leak, no coolant to freeze. Cooling relied entirely on airflow. Transmissions were geared for load, not speed. Suspension was designed to cope with weight, not cornering. On its own terms, it worked. Where it failed was expectation. Owners overloaded them, assuming the boxy shape meant infinite capacity. Families packed them for holidays, like estate cars. Campers added weight without adjusting maintenance. People cruised at motorway speeds. The drivetrain was never designed to sustain for hours. And then came neglect. Valve clearances needed adjustment. Oil changes were non-negotiable. Cooling ducts had to remain clear. Ignoring any of that meant rising temperatures and shortened engine life. But owners didn't see it that way. They saw slow acceleration. They heard noise. They blamed the engine when it struggled up hills, fully loaded. What they didn't see was a vehicle doing exactly what it was built to do, being reliable when used correctly, and vulnerable when abused. Talk to tradesmen from the era, and you hear a different story. Plumbers, builders, and delivery drivers who serviced their T2s properly often ran them for enormous mileages. They understood it as a tool. Families, on the other hand, treated it like a passenger car and felt let down when it didn't behave like one. That's why the Type 2's reputation split so sharply. To some, it was dependable and honest. To others, it was slow and frustrating. Same vehicle, different assumptions. The Volkswagen Type 2 didn't disappoint its designers. It disappointed buyers who misunderstood its purpose, and that misunderstanding followed it for decades. Datsun 180B, 610, 1973-1977. If European cars of the 1970s suffered from buyers expecting too much, Japanese cars suffered from buyers expecting too little. The Datsun 180B, also known as the 610, was dismissed in its day as dull, characterless, and uninspiring. It didn't stir emotion, it didn't feel aspirational, it didn't pretend to be clever, and that was precisely the point. By the mid-1970s, Nissan wasn't trying to impress drivers. They were trying to outlast them, priced competitively against European family saloons. The 180B looked conservative, even when new, simple lines, plain interiors, no pretense of sportiness. Buyers coming from Alfa Romeos, Fords, or British Leyland products often described it as soulless. What they missed was the engineering philosophy underneath. The engines were deliberately understressed. Carburation was conservative. Cooling systems were robust. Components were overbuilt, relative to output. Suspension geometry favored stability over engagement. Nothing about the car one was pushed to its limit. Performance was modest. That wasn't a flaw. It was a decision. while European manufacturers chased refinement, handling, or innovation. Datsun chased predictability. The 180B was designed to tolerate missed services, cheap oil, rough driving, and indifferent ownership. It assumed neglect and planned for it. And that's where the misunderstanding deepened. Buyers criticized the car for lacking excitement, but quietly noticed something else. It started every morning. It didn't overheat in traffic. It didn't dissolve structurally. After 5 winters, repairs were cheap, parts were available, and mechanics understood it immediately. For families coming out of fragile European ownership experiences, this felt like relief, even if it didn't feel like love. There are countless stories from the era of buyers reluctantly switching to a Datsun after being burned by something more glamorous. They expected to be bored. Instead, they were surprised by how uneventful ownership could be. No drama, no betrayals, no sudden terminal failures. Just a car that did what it promised, quietly. That quiet competence reshaped the market. The Datsun 180B didn't win hearts. In the 1970s, it won trust, and that trust laid the foundation for the Japanese dominance that followed in the 1980s and beyond. The irony is simple. The 180B wasn't misunderstood because it failed. It was misunderstood because buyers didn't yet realize reliability was the feature they wanted most. Citroën GS, 1970-1980. If there was one thing 1970s buyers distrusted more than poor reliability, it was complexity. They didn't understand, and no car embodied that fear better than the Citroën GS. On paper, the GS was one of the most advanced family cars of its era. When it launched in 1970, it wasn't radical. For the sake of it, it was radical. Because Citroën believed comfort, stability, and safety mattered more than simplicity. That belief scared people. The GS sat in a competitive space. It wasn't cheap, but it wasn't luxury either. Buyers expected something conventional. What they got was high-drop pneumatic suspension, self-leveling ride height, inboard front brakes, and a level of ride quality that made British and German rivals feel crude. On broken roads, on the move, the GS was extraordinary. It floated over potholes. It remained composed on uneven surfaces. Long journeys were calmer, quieter, and less fatiguing. In rural Europe, where roads were often poor, this mattered enormously. But none of that came without cost. The hydraulic system was not optional. It was the heart of the car. Suspension, braking, and ride control depended on it. It required clean fluid, pressure checks, and attention to seals and spheres. And buyers didn't want that responsibility. They wanted comfort without involvement. They wanted sophistication without learning. They wanted modernity without consequence. When maintenance was skipped, the system degraded quickly. Ride quality collapsed. Brakes felt strange. Warning lights frightened owners who didn't understand what they were seeing. Mechanics unfamiliar with Citroën systems made things worse. Incorrect repairs turned manageable issues into disasters. Stories spread faster than facts. Soon, the GS gained a reputation, not for its brilliance, but for its perceived fragility. Yet owners who understood the car tell a very different story. Maintained properly, the GS was dependable, durable, and uniquely comfortable. Many ran for vast mileages. They weren't unreliable. They were unforgiving of ignorance. That was the real problem. The GS arrived at the exact moment buyers wanted cars to become simpler, not smarter. Complexity felt like risk, and risk felt irresponsible in an unstable economy. Citroën wasn't wrong about comfort. They were early. The GS didn't fail because its ideas were bad. It failed because buyers weren't ready to accept that comfort sometimes comes with complexity and responsibility. Ford Pinto, 1971-1980. No 1970s car carries more historical baggage than the Ford Pinto. Mention the name, and the conversation immediately jumps to lawsuits, safety scandals, and moral failure. In popular memory, the Pinto isn't just a bad car, it's treated as proof that the entire decade was reckless and careless, that narrative-wise is incomplete. The Pinto was born into crisis. By the early 1970s, American car buyers were facing something unfamiliar: scarcity. Fuel prices were rising, insurance costs were climbing, wages were under pressure. For the first time in decades, affordability mattered more than aspiration for millions of families. Ford's brief for the Pinto was brutally simple. Build a cheap, lightweight car, quickly, not refined, not durable for decades, not indulgent. Cheap, light, fast to market. And that decision framed everything that followed. The Pinto used simple engines, basic suspension, and cost-cutting everywhere. That wouldn't immediately stop the car from functioning. It wasn't engineered to be exceptional, it was engineered to meet a price point in an emergency. That's where expectations collided with reality. Buyers assumed new meant safe by default. They assumed modernity brought improvement across the board. They assumed Ford would never sell something fundamentally compromised. But the Pinto wasn't dishonest about what it was. It was basic transportation for people who needed mobility, not prestige. The safety controversy is real. The rear-mounted fuel tank design was vulnerable in certain crash scenarios that cannot be softened or excused. But context matters. Many cars of the era shared similar risks. The difference is that the Pinto became the symbol. Why? Because expectations were higher than the product was ever meant to meet. Families bought Pintos, expecting them to behave like scaled-down full-size Fords. They weren't. They were lighter, thinner, and less forgiving. When pushed beyond their design envelope, high speeds, heavy loads, poor maintenance, consequences followed. Owners who treated Pintos gently often ran them for years, without drama. Those who drove them hard overloaded them, or assumed invulnerability, felt betrayed. The Pinto didn't lie about being cheap. Marketing did the lying for it. It was sold as progress. It was really compromise, and that's the crucial misunderstanding. The Pinto wasn't designed to be loved. It was designed to get families through a difficult decade. At the lowest possible cost, judged on modern expectations, it fails. Judged in its own context, it did exactly what it was built to do: survive an economic downturn. By the end of the 1970s, a pattern had become impossible to ignore, even if buyers didn't yet have the language to describe it. These cars weren't failing. In isolation, they were failing against expectations that no longer matched reality. Look at what connects every car we've discussed. The Austin Allegro asked for care in an era that wanted convenience. The Lancia Beta assumed owner involvement at a time when attention was disappearing. The Volkswagen Type 2 was treated like a car when it was a tool. The Datsun 180B proved reliability mattered more than romance before buyers were ready to admit it. The Citroën GS delivered comfort through complexity when buyers wanted simplicity. The Ford Pinto was built for economic survival, but sold as progress. Different countries, different philosophies, same misunderstanding. Manufacturers were reacting to forces they didn't control: fuel shortages, rapidly changing emissions laws, new safety requirements, inflation, and shrinking household budgets, political pressure to move faster than engineering maturity allowed. Buyers, meanwhile, were shopping emotionally, anchored to memories of the 1960s. They wanted reliability without maintenance, performance without fuel consumption, comfort without complexity, longevity without involvement. Those combinations simply didn't exist yet, so when these cars demanded compromise, owners felt cheated. When they demanded attention, they felt outdated. When they failed under neglect, they were labeled bad. But the truth is more precise. The 1970s didn't produce bad cars, it produced honest cars in a dishonest transition period. And history judged the machines more harshly than the assumptions that broke them. Looking back now, it's easy to laugh at the 1970s. The styling looks awkward. Performance figures feel anemic. Reliability stories have hardened into folklore. From a modern vantage point, the decade feels like a misstep, between two better eras, but that reading misses what the 1970s actually were. They weren't a failure, they were a transition under pressure. For the first time, car manufacturers were forced to balance fuel economy, emissions, safety, cost, and durability all at once, without the computing power, materials science, or manufacturing precision we now take for granted. They were solving new problems with old tools in real time under public scrutiny, and they did it imperfectly. But buyers weren't passive victims. In this story, they brought expectations, shaped by the 1960s, into a world that no longer existed. They expected engines to behave the same way under new emissions constraints. They expected bodies to resist corrosion without better metallurgy. They expected comfort without complexity and reliability without involvement. When those expectations weren't met, the cars took the blame. What the 1970s actually taught the industry was discipline. Manufacturers learned that reliability had to be engineered, not assumed. That maintenance tolerance mattered more than innovation alone. That buyers wanted predictability before excitement. That lesson reshaped the 1980s. Electronic fuel injection matured. Rust protection improved. Quality control tightened. Japanese manufacturers capitalized on everything the 1970s revealed, not because their cars were magical, but because they aligned design with how people actually used vehicles. Today, we romanticize certain 1970s cars and mock others. Both reactions miss the point. These machines were products of constraint, not incompetence. They were built for survival, economic, political, and mechanical, in a decade that offered no easy answers, and in many cases, they succeeded. The real mistake wasn't the engineering, it was expecting certainty in an uncertain decade. Once you understand that, the 1970s stop looking like a disaster. They start looking like the most honest chapter in modern automotive history. So now the question isn't whether 1970s cars were bad, it's whether they were ever judged fairly, because behind every reputation we've discussed, there's a family story, a purchase made under pressure, a decision shaped by fuel queues, inflation, and uncertainty. Cars weren't bought for pleasure. In the 1970s, they were bought for stability. And that's why these machines still matter. Some of you watching lived through this era. Others grew up hearing the stories, the breakdowns, the rust, the disappointment, the quiet relief, when a car simply kept going. Those experiences didn't happen in isolation. They were shared across neighborhoods, families, and entire generations. If your family owned any of these cars, or something similar, your perspective is part of the historical record. Not the myths, not the jokes, the lived reality. Because when you strip away hindsight and nostalgia, you're left with something more useful than blame. Context. If you want more long-form automotive history, that explains why cars were built the way they were, not just whether they were good or bad. Then stay here. These stories don't work as headlines, they only make sense when you slow down and look properly. Next time, we'll dismantle another assumption that's been repeated for decades without being questioned, and put it back together with facts instead of folklore. Every car carries the weight of its time. Sometimes, the car wasn't the problem at all.